Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading, and I've got two of them. I read both of these in the second half of July. First, I'm going to talk about The Face of Battle by John Keegan, and then I'll talk about Hangman's Diary. Now, I read this one for two reasons. The first one is for Historathon 2023, a year-long celebration where we are reading and discussing nonfiction history. And we have divided the year up into 4 quarters, each quarter looking at a different period of history. We are currently in quarter 3, which looks at the years 1500 to 1820. Now, I had originally planned on reading this actually for the previous quarter, which looked at the years 500 to 1500, because this looks actually at 3 different battles. So you see in here the subtitle, The Study of Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme. So I actually have 3 different quarters I could have chosen to read this. I was going to read it last quarter, didn't get to it, but I made sure to get to it this quarter. And Waterloo fits into this quarter's time period. I also read this for a new booktube event that happened this year in July, Booktube at War, which looked at books, nonfiction and fiction, that dealt with war. So I had read a fiction book, Shiloh by Shelby Foote, and then I read this as a nonfiction option. And I'm glad that I did. I've had this on my shelf for a while, been wanting to get to it, and this is my first book that I've read by John Keegan, and I guess I really like him. He started winning me over pretty early on in the book. Some of his references, I marked one of them, just his phrases. He talks about like basically battle formations, and the way, actually no, it was more the way that a certain author was trying to describe a battle, and he's talking about basically the limitations of various ways of writing battles. And he says, quote, "It sounds unbelievably complicated. Indeed, it reads like something from a military Kama Sutra, exciting, intriguing, but likely to have proved a good deal more difficult to practice than it reads on the printed page." So anybody who can talk about military Kama Sutra has basically already gotten my attention. And I liked a lot of his writing style and just his voice overall within this. He was a very good guide, and he's very much honest in the very beginning. He is a historian. He is not somebody who has actually experienced battle himself. So this is all based on research, and he's very clear about that. But I gotta say, he gets very detailed in here. All 3 of these battles, Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme, they all have a pretty healthy amount of documentation. So he has a lot of primary sources to go through to try and figure this out. And I think there's also a lot of archaeological work to help along the way as well. And he begins basically with some excellent opening essays about military history itself, its limitations, its function, the historiography of military history, and, you know, kind of lays out his process. And really, he's trying to give us, as close as possible, what it was like for a soldier during these times. And he does a very good job with that. I was initially really interested in the stuff on Agincourt. And Waterloo was actually for this quarter, but that was pretty good. The Somme ended up proving to be incredibly fascinating as well. So we see not just how, basically how a soldier's experience would be in each of these battles, but we also get to look at how battles have changed. All 3 of these, of course, are English battles. 2 of them, at least, against the French. But he actually gives some excellent perspective about how things change over the centuries with warfare. There's actually some interesting maps in here, too. He begins by giving us a map of Agincourt, but then when he gives us the map of Waterloo, he has Agincourt map there that's put to scale with this. So we can see how big battles have gotten from the time of Agincourt up until the early 1800s. And then he does it again with the Somme. There's the Somme, and that's Waterloo down in the bottom here, for scale. So we can see just how big things have gotten. And there's relevance to that. One of the things that he does talk about towards the end is how things have changed for military commanders. How at Agincourt, the king was right there in the thick of things. In Waterloo, you have the commanders who are also pretty much right there. But by the time of the Somme, they're in the back somewhere. And just how big these battles have gotten, and how there's more of a disconnect in a lot of ways between the commanders and the soldiery. Although he does also talk about how World War I was an instance in which there was a certain amount of democratization that seemed to have happened. A lot of the officers in the beginning of the war came from more well-to-do families, but then they died pretty quickly, and you had people who were not so well-to-do getting advanced. But that kind of experience helped to create a little more of an egalitarian, I guess, movement within English society. So all that stuff was all really good. I thought the detail work was excellent. I was fascinated throughout. And if you're somebody who is interested in military history, and one of the things I will say is I am not partial to books that glorify history. I'm sorry, I misspoke. That glorify war. Glorify history, yes, but I don't like the glorification of war. I think that war is repugnant. And Keegan does not glorify things at all. I mean, he gets down to the dirty and the psychological effect on people, and especially how war can lead to atrocious acts. He basically talks about war crimes, or killing people who have surrendered, or the innocent. What could lead people to that situation? So I thought this was very enlightening, and I would highly recommend it if this is the kind of topic that you are interested in. And I do want to read Keegan again. He's certainly somebody that I'm going to look out for. I did recently acquire his book on World War I, so maybe this year I'll get to that. I'm not entirely sure, but I really like this. I also really like this. This is the next thing that I read. And this was A Hangman's Diary, the Journal of Master Franz Schmidt, Public Executioner of Nuremberg, 1573 to 1617. Now, this was originally published in the 1920s. And his diary, okay, so it says A Hangman's Diary, although he seemed to be cutting people's heads off mostly. He did hang some people. Most people he was chopping their heads off with a two-handed sword. This is actually from a contemporary illustration of him executing somebody, so that is actually him. And that's the second half of the book. Is basically, he would basically keep a record, a diary of the people that he killed, and sometimes he would give you a brief description of their crimes. Now, the first half are essays that look at like the judiciary procedure, legal procedure, and then the role of the executioner, and that stuff was actually also really, really fascinating for different reasons. So the first half of the book are essays that give you insight into the world of the executioner and the legal system in which he was basically taking part. The second half, when we get into the actual diary of it, it's not, the fascination is in the executions, it's more in the crimes. And it ends up being a really interesting window into social history of the time period. But some of the insights I did, you could say I marked some things up. They talk about some of the injustices and how injustices could occur during this time. Because back then, for instance, it was sufficient for somebody to plead guilty, to admit guilt, and that was enough to get them killed. You didn't actually have to have evidence behind it. So they give us one instance that says, thus in 1610, a woman accused of infanticide admitted the crime and named the place where she had buried the victim. Despite the fact that no remains were found at the spot indicated, she was executed. So you have this indication when you're going through Franz Schmidt's diary, and he's talking about different crimes and what people are being killed for. You always have in the back of your head, yeah, but did they do it? Were they actually guilty of the things that they were being accused of? I think there was a couple things here. Just the weird farces. They talk about how they used to put the dead on trial. So the criminal, bound and wearing a felon's garb, white, blue, or black, appeared in court. If he confessed, he was at once condemned. If he denied the charge, the Schofen, which is like the administrator, declared under oath that the man had confessed in their presence at the private examination, and thus the accused could disprove this statement, judgment followed. Should the criminal have died before the trial, the fettered corpse was brought in court. The Richter, or president, called on the dead man to appoint an advocate. As the accused was unable to do so, the prosecutor proceeded to surmise that the man was dead, whereupon the Chauffin viewed the body and verified the decease. When they had done so, the corpse was provided with an advocate, who, on the grounds that his client was not in full possession of his faculties, demanded the assistance of the chauffeur, with whom he discussed the charge and tried to defend his client's innocence. After he had finished, the court passed judgment. This gruesome farce was abandoned in 1526, when the law pronounced it was unseemly to prosecute the dead. I mean, if you can just imagine these situations, it's absolutely incredible. And they go into some of of course, the terrible execution methods. Talk about drowning. Schmidt actually advocated, Franz Schmidt, he advocated that women should be beheaded, not drowned, which was seen as a mercy. One of the interesting phrases that's repeated over and over in the diary, they were beheaded. now that I'm saying that, I'm forgetting exactly how he says it, but it's basically, they were beheaded as a favor. You see that over again. Yeah, beheaded and put on the wheel. Trying to see if I could find one of those sections where he actually says it. Yeah, you can see it right here. A thief beheaded as a favor. So we have the favor of getting your head cut off, but they give you an example of why that was. It says drowning was carried out near the Hallerweise, a wooden stage built over the Pignets. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these correct. And from it the felon, enclosed in a sack, was thrown into the river and kept below the surface by means of a pole that the lova handled. One poor wretch contrived to free herself from the sack and swam, imploring for mercy, but was not reprieved, though her death struggles lasted almost a full hour. The horror of this execution induced the council, by Schmidt's advice, to abolish this method of punishment in favor of beheading when women were to be the sufferers. So he cut off a lot of people's heads. He killed over 300 people, and it seems like most of these people he was beheading. Now, what this ends up being really interesting when you start getting into the actual diary, it's kind of a list. It's an inventory of all these people who died in their crimes, but it just gives you an idea to this bizarre world. It talks about this one guy. This is on April 1st, 1601. Bastian Grubel, a vagabond and thief who stole much and besides confessed to 20 murders. Among these victims were 5 pregnant women, whom he had caused to live in debauchery with his companions, then cut them open and cut off the hands of the infants, and made candles of their hands to be used in burglaries. We have weird details like that. Now, I have come across like an idea of like a thieves' candle, of like creating candles from hands, and which I guess is supposed to somehow assist in the thievery, like some kind of occult reason. He doesn't go into detail with that, but when you read details like that, you can only imagine, did this really happen, or is this somebody that was something that was confessed to under duress and torture, and they just accepted it? You get a lot of odd things like that, and it talks about how the people who were executed, like how many mementos they were taking, because he also dissected people afterwards. He would cut them open, he would perform autopsies, but also just for medical reasons and scientific reasons, he would just kind of cut them open to check them out. But sometimes people could pay for relics. They could pay for hands, they could pay for limbs. Some people would pay to try and drink the blood from the severed head as it came off the stage, thinking it had some magical properties. I mean, this is just gruesome stuff. Just seeing where it has some of the other things. Yeah, here's another instance. He talks about how somebody he just beheaded. He said, beheaded here. When placed on the stone, because there was something called the Raven Stone that they would put the head on. When placed on the stone, his head turned several times as if it wanted to look about, moved its tongue and opened its mouth as if wanting to speak for a good quarter of an hour. I have never seen the like of this. I mean, these weird details that he throws in there. But there's also like odd things that you just want to know more about what was happening. After the executions, there's a short section on some of the torturing that he did. And we've got this one guy, this is in 1586. The Shepherd of Air. Because for the last 2 years he had played the ghost in the house and tugged at people's feet or heads in their sleep. By this means he contrived to have connection with the peasant's daughter, flogged out of the place. So this guy pretending to be a ghost for 2 years, pulling on people while they sleep. I mean, what's the story behind that? So this is a very quick read. The font is quite large for the page. It doesn't take you long to get through it at all, but I thought this was actually really fascinating stuff. Not just in the kind of macabre history that we're given, but an interesting window into social history of the time period. So these were both winners for me. Got The Face of Battle by John Keegan. Terrific insight into the nature of war and what it was like for soldiers. And then we have another gruesome spectacle, what it was like for the executioner and also for the condemned in the Hangman's Diary. So if you're reading these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.